You are handing strangers a knife every single time you let them see what frustrates you. Watch someone cross a crowded room at a cocktail party, tracking your face like an instrument panel. They aren't looking at you because you are interesting. They are scanning for your trigger points. Every sigh you heave, every defensive sentence you snap back, every flush of anger across your neck is a literal lever. You built it. You calibrated it. And now, anyone with half an ounce of social friction can walk up, grab the handle, and steer your entire afternoon without you noticing the turn of the wheel. Consider how wild animals handle terrain. A predator does not broadcast its route, nor does it rage at the storm. It moves through the brush so silently that the leaves barely shift. Human interaction operates on the exact same ancient mechanics, disguised beneath polite vocabulary. When a colleague drops a passive-aggressive comment in a Tuesday morning meeting, they are testing the weight of the handle. They want to see if your breathing changes. They want to know if you will lunge, defend, or retreat. The moment you offer a micro-expression of annoyance, you have registered on their radar as manageable. You become a known quantity. And a known quantity is always subjugated by someone who refuses to reveal their own internal weather. Think about the last argument that ruined your evening. You replay it in your head, not because of what was said, but because you lost your composure. You gave them the satisfaction of your agitation. That feeling of lingering exposure is the ghost of a handle being pulled long after the room is empty. In the courts of Renaissance Italy, observers noted that the most dangerous diplomats never raised their voices, not out of virtue, but because a raised voice surrenders the high ground of surprise. They understood that an emotional reaction is an open confession of weakness. It tells the room precisely what amount of pressure is required to break your discipline. Imagine walking into your next high-stakes negotiation or family gathering and realizing that every single person there is blindfolded except you. They are swinging blindly at air where your triggers used to live. They push, and nothing moves. They provoke, and you respond with a flat, indifferent calm that feels to them like a brick wall. That quietness is not a personality trait. It is a calculated boundary. Yet, as you sit there nodding, thinking about the people in your life whose constant prodding you need to endure, ask yourself a quiet, uncomfortable question. Who taught you how to react like that in the first place? Whose hands have been steering you while you were busy trying to steer everyone else? When you stop reacting, the steering wheel detaches entirely, leaving anyone who tries to turn you grasping at empty air. But letting go of the dash is only the first step. The real architecture of power begins when you look at the hidden tax you pay every single time you make yourself instantly accessible. Consider how a luxury brand operates. A rare timepiece or a coveted piece of real estate does not fling its doors open to every passerby at all hours of the day. Scarcity manufactures worth long before quality ever enters the conversation. Yet in your daily life, you treat your attention like a clearance sale. You reply to texts within seconds, clear your schedule at the slightest whim of a colleague, and answer emails late into the night, believing this proves your dedication. In reality, you are broadcasting a quiet, devastating message to everyone watching. You are telling them your time possesses zero intrinsic value. Think of 17th-century diplomats operating in the courts of Europe. A seasoned ambassador never granted an immediate audience to a foreign envoy, no matter how urgent the dispatch. To be seen on demand was to signal desperation, to silently confess that your position was weak and your calendar empty. By forcing suitors to wait days or weeks for an audience, they transformed a simple meeting into a rare privilege. The modern office or social circle operates by the exact same unspoken hierarchy. High responsiveness is a tax on your dignity. Every time you pick up the phone on the first ring, you hand the other person a ledger where they record your time as cheap and infinitely renewable. The moment you introduce friction into your availability, an invisible shift occurs in the room. People stop assuming they own your schedule and begin negotiating for it. You stop being the background noise of their day and become an event they must prepare for. But the mechanics of accessibility run even deeper than your calendar. What happens when your availability is not just about time, but about information? Most people leak their internal states constantly. They narrate their frustrations, broadcast their fatigue, and explain every decision they make as if they owe the world an audit of their motives. They are like a fortress with the gates thrown wide open, wondering why strangers walked in and rearranged the furniture. If you want to become truly unreachable, you must starve the room of your explanations. When you stop justifying your choices, you deny people the leverage they need to pull you into their theater. You become a blank wall that they can project their anxieties onto, but never penetrate. Yet, as you lock down your time and seal off your motives, a dangerous new vulnerability emerges. What happens when the people around you realize they can no longer read your temperature? That immediate text message sitting on your glowing screen right now is not a conversation. It is a leash. When you reply instantly, you are signaling that your time has no independent gravity, that your orbit belongs to whoever chose to pull the trigger first. People respect the slow responder not because they are playing games, but because biological instinct bows to the unavailable. Scarcity manufactures worth. But withholding your words is only the entry-level tactic. The real leverage begins when you stop talking altogether in the middle of a high-stakes exchange. Picture a tense salary negotiation across a glass table. You have just named your number, and instead of defending it, justifying it, or softening the blow with a nervous laugh, you simply lean back and close your mouth. Amateurs believe silence is an awkward void that needs to be filled with justifications. A strategist knows silence is a mirror. In a corporate boardroom, the person who speaks first after a proposal is dropped has just surrendered the terrain. They have shown their anxiety. Think of how chess grandmasters use time. They will sit motionless over a piece for 20 minutes, not because the move is complex, but because the psychological weight of their stillness is crushing the opponent's nerve on the other side of the board. When you offer unyielding quiet in response to a demand, an accusation, or an emotional plea, you weaponize the other person's internal insecurities. Without your feedback, their mind turns inward. They begin to audit their own words, doubt their own position, and frantically negotiate against themselves to fill the suffocating vacuum you created. You stop being a participant and become a blank wall. Napoleon understood this dynamic intimately when dealing with foreign diplomats. He would listen to fiery ultimatums, offer no facial expression, and give no immediate reply. He would simply stare. Foreign ministers often broke under that gaze, starting to retract their own terms, offer unnecessary concessions, and babble apologies just to break the agonizing tension. They were fighting a ghost because Napoleon refused to give them a target to aim at. Notice how this plays out in your own life during arguments with friends or partners. When someone tries to bait you into an emotional defense, and you respond with calm, unblinking quiet, their anger quickly curdles into panic. They are no longer angry at what you did, they are terrified of what you are thinking. You have successfully stripped away their handles. They cannot push or pull a door that has no latch. Yet, mastering tactical quietness requires you to look at your own terrifying addiction to approval. Why does silence feel so physically painful to hold? Why does your chest tighten when someone leaves a question hanging in the air? Because deep down, you have been conditioned to believe that your voice is the only thing protecting you from irrelevance. What happens when you finally starve them of your noise, only to discover that the person most terrified of your silence is not your opponent, but you? That empty, prolonged pause works because an argument is a game of tennis, and when you refuse to swing, the ball simply drops to the ground. You have starved their momentum. But what happens when the attack isn't verbal, when it is a sudden, aggressive push from an adversary trying to force your hand? In feudal Japan, master swordsmen understood a counterintuitive law of combat: never brace against a heavy strike. To brace is to offer your bones to the impact. Instead, they practiced the art of absorbing the blow by moving seamlessly with the force of the blade, neutralizing its weight by yielding entirely. Think about how you react when someone hurls an unprovoked accusation at you in a meeting or a quiet hallway. Your pulse spikes, your throat tightens, and your immediate instinct is to defend your territory. That defensive reflex is your handle. The moment you push back, you hand them the steering wheel of your nervous system. They wanted a sparring partner, and you gave them one. Imagine instead that you become a vacuum. When an aggressive colleague corners you with a manufactured crisis, designed specifically to watch you scramble, you do not rebut, you do not sweat, and you do not explain. You lean into their hostility with absolute, terrifying stillness. You agree with their premise just enough to leave them stranded without an argument. You look them in the eye and say, "You might be entirely right about that." Suddenly, their weapon meets no resistance. Their pent-up aggression has nowhere to land, so it turns inward and consumes them. It is the psychological equivalent of stepping aside when someone lunges at you with a heavy staff. They stumble forward from the sheer force of their own momentum. This is radical non-resistance, and it is devastatingly effective because human beings are wired to fight friction. When they encounter zero friction, they panic. They lose their footing because they prepared for a battle, and you gave them a mirror. Notice what happens in your own chest when you try this tomorrow. Your mind will scream at you to defend your honor, to speak up, to prove your competence. That internal panic is the sound of your old programming breaking down. You are no longer managing your image, you are managing the space between stimulus and response. Yet, mastering stillness is only half the architecture of absolute composure. What happens when the person trying to break your discipline isn't an open adversary, but someone close enough to know every single password to your insecurities? By agreeing with an insult before it leaves their teeth, you wrenched the weapon from their grip and forced them to stare at an empty hand. They wanted a sparring partner, you gave them a mirror. But neutralizing a counterpunch is merely defense. The master player does not survive the match by blocking, they win by making the opponent forget what game is being played. Look closely at how intelligence networks operate in hostile territory. They do not hide through invisibility, they hide through monotony. A spy never acts like a ghost because ghosts attract attention. Instead, they become the most aggressively boring object in the room. When you broadcast a grand ambition, a clear timeline, or a passionate objective, you hand your rivals an architectural blueprint of your future. They no longer have to guess your next move because you stood on a table and announced it. You became legible. And in the mechanics of human strategy, legibility is vulnerability. Think of the 19th century railroad barons. While competitors engaged in loud, visible proxy wars over every mile of track, quiet syndicates purchased the land titles silently through shell corporations, displaying all the urgency of a stone. By the time their rivals noticed the horizon shifting, the tracks were already laid and the stations were open. They masked their entire empire behind a wall of calculated tediousness. They made people yawn. Now look at your own calendar. How many of your personal goals, career shifts, or quiet grievances are you currently advertising to people who have no stake in your survival? Every time you explain your trajectory, you invite friction. You give the architecture of your ambition to people who lack the blueprint. Imagine sitting across from someone who expects you to react with ambition, anger, or anxiety, only to find themselves drowning in your absolute, unyielding grayness. You offer no milestones to celebrate, no failures to pity, no timeline to sabotage. You become a blank wall in a house of mirrors. Yet, sealing your intentions behind a wall of boredom creates a strange internal pressure. What happens when your own mind rebels against the silence, demanding an audience for the very plans you are trying to protect? When your face reveals nothing, people start projecting their own anxieties onto your silence. They fill the vacuum. They confess things they never intended to say simply because your lack of reaction feels like an unscaled wall. Consider how top-tier negotiators operate in a high-stakes hostage crisis. They do not raise their voice or display anger when threatened. They lean into a flat, unreadable composure that forces the aggressor to exhaust their own adrenaline. The hostage-taker starts negotiating against themselves, trying to decode a face that refuses to offer a single clue. You can apply this exact mechanics in a mundane office politics meeting or a tense family dinner. You sit physically present in the room, breathing the same air, nodding at the appropriate intervals, yet your internal self is safely locked behind a heavy, invisible vault. Here is where most people fail entirely. They think detachment requires physical absence. They believe they need to quit the group chat, ghost their colleagues, or move to a cabin in the woods to protect their peace. That is amateur hour. True detachment is entirely internal. It is the art of being physically anchored while mentally floating miles above the chaos. Think of Cardinal Richelieu, the 17th-century French statesman who practically ruled France from the shadows while his political rivals screamed themselves hoarse in the royal court. He rarely raised his voice. He rarely engaged in petty retaliation. He simply engineered a vast psychological distance between his true intentions and the persona he presented to the world. To the courtiers, he seemed accessible, polite, and entirely transparent. Yet no one in Paris actually knew what he was thinking until the arrest warrants were already signed. He was a ghost sitting right beside them at the banquet table. This brings us to a strange, unsettling truth about how human attention actually works. We are biologically wired to track movement, emotional spikes, and vocal inflection. When you strip all three away, you stop registering as a threat or an ally in the traditional sense. You become background architecture. People lean against you without realizing you are a pillar. They reveal their alliances, their weaknesses, and their secret desperation right in front of you, treating you like the wallpaper because you give them nothing to push against. Try this tomorrow. During a heated argument or a passive-aggressive exchange, do not defend yourself. Do not offer a counter-argument. Simply lower your heart rate, soften your posture, and watch them burn through their emotional fuel trying to provoke a spark from damp wood. Notice how quickly they stumble when their favorite weapon, your predictable emotional trigger, turns into a dead end. Yet, mastering this quiet invisibility carries a hidden cost that few are willing to pay. Once you learn how to detach completely while sitting inches away from your adversaries, a strange numbness begins to bleed into the rest of your life. The same mental armor that blocks their hostility eventually blocks your own joy, leaving you wondering where the person you used to be actually went. Detachment is not a bunker you hide inside, it is the quiet recognition that you are no longer holding anything ransom. When you ask if total isolation is the price of freedom, you are looking at the problem through the wrong end of the telescope. You assume that solitude is a penalty when it is actually a clearance sale on your vulnerabilities. If you want to understand why external coercion fails against a truly disciplined mind, look at how the Roman Stoic Epictetus lived his life. He was a literal slave who possessed less than nothing, yet he terrified his masters simply because he had unlearned the habit of needing their approval, their anger, or their mercy. They could chain his leg, but they could not construct a lever long enough to move his will. Pivot. That level of internal fortress building looks terrifying until you test it in the fluorescent lit arena of a modern office. Imagine sitting across a mahogany table from a superior who relies entirely on manufactured urgency to break your focus. They sigh loudly, check their watch, and weaponize disappointment with the precision of a surgeon. They are not managing the project, they are managing your need to be seen as competent. The moment you stop caring about the theatrical performance of being a good employee, their entire arsenal turns into static. You stop rushing. You stop over-explaining. You become a blank wall that absorbs their pressure and reflects nothing back. Bureaucracies thrive on your hidden panic, and they starve to death the second you refuse to supply it. Power does not belong to the person who can shout the loudest or scheme the deepest. Power belongs entirely to the person who wants the least. Think about the mechanics of a negotiation. Every concession you make is purchased with a piece of your appetite, your desire for comfort, your fear of looking foolish, your craving for a quick win. If an adversary knows what you desperately want, they do not need to fight you, they simply have to make you pay installments on it until you bankrupt your own strategy. The secret that political operators use to survive hostile environments is not hiding their emotions behind a mask. It is systematically auditing their own internal inventory until there is nothing left on the shelves that anyone else can afford to buy. When your private desires are no longer up for public auction, the marketplace loses its grip on you. People will try to hand you handles, of course. They will offer praise that tastes like honey but acts like a tracking device, or criticism designed to make you claw at your own skin to fix a flaw that only exists in their imagination. You watch them reach for the controls, their fingers grasping at air where your triggers used to be. But the handle is gone, filed down to the metal. They keep pulling, but the door refuses to open. What happens when someone realizes that every lever they pull in their life leads directly to an empty room? When you refuse to want anything from them, their entire framework for understanding human interaction shatters. They spend years studying leverage, mapping your ambitions, calculating your weaknesses, and stocking up on rewards and punishments to steer your behavior. And then you arrive, utterly vacant of hunger, looking at their arsenal of influence as if it were a collection of dust. But here is the secret price of that absolute sovereignty that no book on strategy admits. You built these iron walls not because you were cold, but because you were terrified of what would happen if anyone ever got close enough to see the panic underneath. Consider the solitary monarch who surrounds his fortress with spiked moats and guards who never blink. He tells his counselors that this architecture is a monument to his genius, a testament to his untouchable stature. But if you walk past the guards and look into his eyes in the dead of night, you see a man imprisoned by his own design. Your discipline, your terrifying emotional economy, your refusal to flinch or knead or bleed in public, it is not an offensive weapon. It is the most sophisticated armor ever constructed to hide a trembling heart. Think about the last time someone offered you genuine, unconditional warmth. Did you lean into it? Or did you immediately scan the horizon for the hidden fee, the trapdoor, the inevitable betrayal? You call it hyper-awareness. You call it strategic vigilance. It is actually just scar tissue wearing a crown. We study the mechanics of power because the alternative, being casually, accidentally destroyed by someone who matters to us, is too agonizing to contemplate. You mastered detachment because attachment felt like standing on thin ice while someone jumped up and down with a sledgehammer. Every single rule of emotional containment you have adopted is a confession. When you practice the art of never showing anger, you are admitting that your anger is a wild animal you cannot trust yourself to leash. When you practice the art of never needing praise, you are admitting that a single word of criticism could hollow you out for weeks. You use strategy the way a terrified child uses a nightlight, convincing yourself that if you just understand the shadows well enough, they can never reach out and touch you. So you sit there in your calculated silence, feeling like a god who has transcended the petty friction of human need. You watch others stumble through their messy, emotional lives, shaking your head at their lack of discipline. Yet every time you feel that sudden spike of panic because someone managed to surprise you, just for a second, the illusion cracks. And that brings us to the moment you realize the most dangerous person in any room is not the one who has learned how to suppress their emotions, but the one who no longer needs the armor to survive. You are building that fortress not to hide from the room, but because you finally realize the room was never real. What you thought was a community of peers, lovers, and rivals was always just a crowded marketplace of leverage seekers, all waiting to grab the handles you used to leave conveniently exposed. Now that you have detached those handles, now that your face remains flat when the insult lands and your calendar reveals nothing to those who demand access, something strange happens to the silence around you. People do not respect your boundaries, they resent your vacancy. They reach for handles that are no longer there, and their fingers grasp only empty air. That sudden, violent withdrawal of their ability to affect you creates a vacuum. In nature, a vacuum does not stay empty for long. Consider the solitary confinement of absolute tactical independence. When Frederick the Great reorganized his infantry, he did not just teach them to march in step, he taught them to fight in loose formations where a single soldier could function without waiting for orders from the center. But the cost of that autonomy was profound. The Prussian officer who could survive entirely on his own initiative was also the officer who could no longer sit comfortably by a tavern fire without analyzing the escape routes and choke points of the room. Once you see the strings, you can never unsee the puppeteers, even when the stage is empty and the actors have gone home. You walk through a grocery store or sit in a corporate meeting, and instead of hearing conversation, you hear the hidden calculations of status, the silent bids for dominance, the desperate avoidance of insignificance. This is the quiet tragedy of the unreachable life. You set out to conquer your impulses so that no one else could command them, but in doing so, you have rendered yourself an exile in plain sight. There is an unmistakable chill that comes with complete self-possession. When your internal weather no longer matches the storms around you, you lose the ability to pretend that you are entirely swept up in the shared delusion of human urgency. You watch people destroy themselves over promotions that mean nothing, over slights that evaporate by Tuesday, and you feel the immense, heavy distance between their frantic theater and your absolute stillness. You wanted power, and power was what you took. But power, at its highest altitude, is just another word for being completely alone on a very tall hill, watching the lights burn out in the valley below, wondering who you were trying to impress before you realized nobody was looking. Power is not a crown you wear among the living. It is the cold, silent realization that you no longer need anyone's permission to exist.